are right now, I hope you're comfortable. Maybe the light around you is dim, or the world outside your window has grown quiet. Perhaps there's the soft hum of something familiar, a fan, a whisper of traffic, or just the steady rhythm of your own breathing. Tonight, let's drift into the forest. Not the forest as a postcard or a hiking trail, but the living, breathing organism that it truly is. A world older than human memory, where every movement, every whisper of wind, every fallen leaf becomes part of a language few of us have ever truly heard. Our story begins with a question. How do trees remember the wind? It's a poetic question, yes, but also a scientific one. Because trees, though rooted and silent, are not still. They live in slow motion, listening, adapting, remembering. Each gust of air that brushes their leaves, each storm that bends their branches, leaves behind a trace, a pattern woven into the very structure of their wood. If you were to walk into a forest after a storm, you might notice something subtle. Some trees lean a little more to one side. Some have thicker trunks. Some seem to shiver quietly, even when the air is calm. To most of us, this seems random, the way nature just happens. But to a biologist or an ecologist, it's evidence of memory. The memory written in wood. Inside a tree, memory doesn't look like ours. There are no neurons, no synapses, no electric sparks firing in the dark. But there are patterns, structures shaped by experience. When a strong wind bends a tree, its tissues feel that pressure. Cells deep inside the trunk sense the strain and begin to grow differently. The wood becomes denser on the side that bears the brunt of the wind. This is called thigmomorphogenesis, the biological process by which plants alter their growth in response to mechanical stress. It's a long word for something deeply intuitive, the way living things remember touch. Imagine this, a sapling sways in a strong wind. Each time it bends, it learns a little. Over days, weeks, and seasons, the tree builds itself around those lessons. Its fibers toughen. Its trunk thickens where the strain was greatest. Its branches redistribute weight to keep balance. So when the next storm comes, the tree is ready. It doesn't consciously recall the previous winds, but it has become its own memory. In a way, this is how all of nature remembers, not through thought, but through form. The world keeps a record of what has happened by changing shape, listening to pressure. If you place a stethoscope against a tree during a windstorm, something scientists have actually done, you would hear faint clicks and pops inside. Tiny microfractures form as the tree flexes, not breaking but adjusting. These are not signs of damage, but signs of adaptation. Deep inside the xylem, the water-carrying vessels of the tree, vibrations travel faster than sound. When wind pushes a branch, it sends a wave of tension through the whole organism. Cells sense it through structures in their walls called mechanoreceptors. These receptors translate pressure into a kind of cellular language, one that triggers chemical messengers and alters gene expression. The tree, in other words, listens through its own body. It doesn't think the way we do, but it feels the shape of the world and responds accordingly. And over years, sometimes centuries, those responses accumulate. A pine that grew on a windswept hill becomes stout and low, while its cousin in the valley rises tall and straight. The difference between them is not chance, it's experience. A memory of motion. We often think of plants as static, passive backdrops to the moving life around them. But they move too. They move in ways that unfold over hours, days, or decades, so slowly that the human eye rarely notices. Time-lapse photography changed that perception. When scientists began to film trees and plants over long periods, they discovered a hidden choreography. Branches sway and twist with intention, leaves tilt to follow light, roots curl through soil like patient fingers searching for water. When the wind arrives, this hidden motion becomes visible. It's not just random fluttering, it's a distributed dance of flexibility and restraint. Each leaf adjusts its angle to reduce drag. Each branch bends just enough to absorb energy without breaking. Over time, this motion leaves a record. The cells that felt the greatest strain grow differently. New wood forms with fibers angled along the lines of force. The memory of the wind becomes architecture. Some researchers describe this as structural memory. The tree's shape is a living history book, each ring and curve a record of what it has endured. In that sense, a forest is an archive, a slow accumulation of environmental memory, written in cellulose and lignin instead of ink. The tree's inner library. If we cut across a fallen trunk, and let's do so gently in imagination without harm, we see a circle of rings. Each ring marks a year of growth. Light and dark bands alternate, one for the fast-growing spring, one for the slower, denser summer. But the rings tell more than time. They tell of droughts, floods, fires, and windstorms. Dendrochronologists, scientists who study tree rings, can reconstruct centuries of weather from these patterns. They can see the cold snap of a distant winter, the year a river overflowed, or the seasons when high winds shaped the land. The tree does remember these events as stories. It remembers them as structure, as subtle changes in density, in fiber direction, in the chemistry of its wood. But to those who know how to read it, that structure is a narrative as rich as any human chronicle. In the forests of Scandinavia, for example, scientists have matched tree ring patterns across thousands of years, creating a continuous record that reaches back to the Ice Age. In that timeline, you can trace the echoes of ancient winds, the same atmospheric rhythms that once brushed the faces of our ancestors. So when you stand beside an old oak and feel the breeze stir its leaves, you're standing in the presence of memory. Not your memory, not mine, but the earth. The language of sway. In 2012, researchers at the University of Florence did an experiment with poplar trees. They exposed some to gentle mechanical shaking and left others untouched. The shaken trees grew shorter and sturdier, their trunks thickened, their cell walls reinforced. Even weeks after the shaking stopped, their growth patterns remained different. This was not random, it was remembered. A kind of embodied learning. It's a principle that applies beyond trees. Grass, vines, even tiny seedlings all respond to touch and motion. The famous experiment by Charles Darwin and his son Francis in the 1880s showed that when a seedling's tip is touched repeatedly, it changes its growth direction, as though it has learned where not to go. Darwin called this plant sensitivity, and he was among the first to suggest that plants might possess a primitive form of awareness. Today, we might call it mechanosensory memory. But whatever we name it, the essence is simple. Every touch, every gust, every shadow of force leaves a trace. In that sense, a tree remembers the wind the way water remembers the shape of the riverbank, not by thought, but by form. The patience of the living world. As the light fades in our imagined forest, the air grows still. You can almost hear the of silence that isn't empty, but full of listening. If you were to stay here through the night, you'd see how the forest breathes. Tiny pores on the leaves, called stomata, close to conserve moisture. Sap pressure changes, shifting subtly like blood flow. Even in darkness, life continues its slow dialogue with the air. Somewhere in the soil, fine roots move, so small you'd need a microscope to see them. They press through grains of earth, mapping the underground world inch by inch. And just like their branches above, these roots remember pressure, direction, and resistance. They learn the architecture of their surroundings. Through networks of mycorrhizal fungi, delicate white threads that connect roots across vast distances, one tree can even warn another. When wind damage or insect attack occurs, chemical signals pass underground, priming neighbors to adjust their metabolism or strengthen their tissues. It's not speech as we know it, but it is communication. And communication in its simplest form is memory shared. The forest that learns. Scientists studying repeated wind exposure in poplars found something remarkable. Not only do trees change their structure in response to wind, they retain a kind of genetic readiness. Even new shoots that grow later exhibit different sensitivities, as though the memory has been imprinted in their developmental programming. This raises profound questions about what it means to learn. If a tree can adjust its growth strategy based on past experience and pass that adjustment to new tissue, then the boundary between reflex and memory begins to blur. Perhaps life doesn't need a brain to remember. Perhaps memory is the fundamental property of being alive, the capacity to change because something once happened. From that perspective, every cell on Earth carries memory. The memory of pressure, light, heat, chemistry, time. And trees, being so long-lived, simply remember longer. The forest at night becomes a cathedral of patience. The wind stirs again, and leaves rustle in overlapping rhythms. 1,000 small conversations blending into one. You realize, listening, that the trees are not passive against the wind. They are participating in it. Each gust is both teacher and sculptor, and the forest, as a whole, becomes a memory of motion turned into form. When you walk among them tomorrow, perhaps you'll notice how each trunk curves just so, how each branch bends toward light or away from prevailing wind. That's not randomness. That's memory, slow, biological, unspoken memory. And in their silence, they have been listening longer than any of us have existed. When morning comes to the forest, it doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, a quiet silver light filtering through mist and branches. The ground, still damp from the night, exhales a faint, earthy scent. Somewhere above, the first thin rays of sun brush against dew-soaked leaves and the forest stirs awake. You can feel it, a slow turning toward light. Each leaf reorients, each branch adjusts ever so slightly. Its movement measured not in seconds, but in hours. The forest, in its own language of slowness, is remembering the direction of warmth and wind. Last night we drifted through the idea that trees can remember, not through thought or words, but through the way they grow. This morning we'll look deeper into the shape of that memory. Because what begins as a response to pressure becomes something more, a record of resilience, of experience etched into living architecture. The geometry of adaptation. If you look closely at a tree that spent its life on a windswept cliff, you'll notice how its branches twist and curl away from the prevailing gusts. The wood grain itself spirals, following invisible lines of force. This is not random artistry. It's biomechanics, nature's own engineering. Wood is anisotropic, meaning it doesn't have uniform strength in every direction. It's strongest along the grain, weaker across it. So when a tree grows, it constantly adjusts its internal geometry to distribute tension and compression. Over time, these microscopic adjustments accumulate. The trunk thickens on the side facing the wind, the reaction wood. In conifers, this is called compression wood, rich in lignin, dense and dark. In broadleaf trees, it's called tension wood, formed on the opposite side, pulling the tree upright like a muscle. It's as if the tree has an inner memory of balance, constantly recalibrating itself, learning the shape of the world's forces. When scientists model this process mathematically, they often find that trees behave like self-optimizing structures. Given enough time and pressure, they naturally evolve the most efficient form for their environment, minimizing stress, maximizing strength, using the least material possible. It's evolution, yes, but it's also adaptation within a single lifetime. Each tree is an experiment in remembering how to stand. Rings as records. The next time you see a cross-section of a tree trunk, whether in a museum or an old log, notice how the rings aren't perfectly concentric. They're often thicker on one side, thinner on another. Those asymmetries are stories. The thicker side might mark the direction of greatest growth, perhaps facing the sun or away from the wind. Sometimes a scar appears, a dark streak of resin where lightning struck or insects burrowed. Each irregularity is a line in the diary of that tree's life. Dendrochronologists can use these variations to infer wind direction decades, even centuries ago. In the twisted pines of Patagonia, researchers have traced patterns of prevailing winds across millennia by studying how compression wood forms on the windward side of trunks. It's remarkable, the atmosphere itself, recorded not in instruments or charts, but in the bodies of living trees. The tree doesn't know it's keeping records. It simply responds, and that response is the record. The memory is not separate from the body. The memory is the body. Cellular echoes. Let's travel deeper, not through the forest, but through the tree itself. Imagine zooming down through the bark, past the phloem and cambium, into the wood cells where growth takes place. Here, in this microscopic world, the story of memory continues. When wind pressure flexes the trunk, certain cells sense tension through changes in their membranes. Tiny proteins, known as mechanosensitive ion channels, open to allow calcium ions to rush in. That small electrical pulse triggers a cascade of biochemical signals, activating genes responsible for strengthening the cell wall, rearranging cellulose fibers, or increasing lignin production. In that moment, a physical event, a gust of wind, becomes a biological response. And if the same force happens again and again, those signaling pathways become primed, more responsive. In some species, this even leads to epigenetic memory, small chemical marks added to DNA that influence how genes are expressed later, long after the wind has stopped. So when we say that a tree remembers the wind, it's not metaphor alone. There's a molecular trace, a biological echo of motion. The wind's signature. Every place on Earth has its own signature of air. The steady trade winds across the tropics, the erratic gusts over mountain ridges, the soft, circular breezes of coastal mornings. Each leaves a distinct fingerprint on the vegetation it touches. In Japan, Along the Sea of Okhotsk, there are forests where all the trees lean inland at identical angles, not because of a single storm, but because of a lifetime of wind. The same pattern appears in the Falkland Islands, where the relentless southern gales sculpt trees into natural arches, known locally as flag trees. To stand beneath them is to see time itself bent by the wind. These living sculptures are not accidents. They are evidence of persistence, memory written in form. And while we might call them deformed, nature would call them adapted. In the language of the forest, every curve and lean is wisdom accumulated. The conversation beneath. Memory in trees doesn't live only in wood or cells. It lives underground too. Through a network of fungal threads, the mycorrhizal network trees share resources and information. A gust that breaks one tree's branch can send a chemical signal through the soil, triggering nearby trees to alter their metabolism, sometimes even shifting nutrient flow. Susan Simard, a Canadian ecologist, famously showed that these underground connections can transmit carbon, nitrogen, and chemical messages across entire stands of forest. Some older trees, the so-called mother trees, act as hubs, redistributing resources to younger ones when times are hard. When a storm passes, these networks change. Root connections are strained, nutrient exchanges fluctuate, and the signals of stress echo underground for days. So even if a tree stands alone above ground, beneath the soil it is never solitary. And if memory is the capacity to retain and respond to experience, then perhaps the forest as a whole remembers, too, as a single, distributed mind made of roots, fungi, and slow communication. Wind as teacher. For a young tree, wind is both threat and teacher. In a windless greenhouse, trees grow tall but fragile. Their trunks are thin, their wood soft. When exposed to the outdoors, they often snap in the first storm. This is why foresters sometimes deliberately expose saplings to controlled wind, a practice called mechanical conditioning. A gentle breeze, repeated daily, produces stronger, more resilient wood. It's as if the tree must learn to live with motion, to let go of rigidity and find strength in flexibility. There's a lesson there for us too, because humans, like trees, often grow stronger when we bend. When life pushes and pulls at us, we adapt, forming invisible rings of resilience. The tree remembers the wind, we remember the struggle. Both forms of memory are stories written in structure. The whisper of time. Stand in a forest on a calm day, and you can still feel traces of past storms. The way certain trunks lean, the open gaps where branches once fell, the twisted shapes of trees that have been pushed for years in the same direction. Every piece of the landscape is a whisper of time. Wind is one of Earth's oldest sculptors. Long before humans or even mammals, wind shaped the distribution of seeds, the erosion of rock, the evolution of plant forms. The first trees, towering lycophytes of the Devonian period, 400 million years ago, learned to anchor themselves against the air's invisible current. Without that challenge, wood might never have evolved its remarkable strength. In a sense, every tree alive today carries the genetic memory of those ancient winds, the pressure that forced their ancestors to grow thicker, taller, more resilient. So when we talk about memory, we're talking about inheritance as well. The knowledge of air encoded across generations. The breath between worlds. At a slower rhythm, wind and tree form a duet, a back and forth exchange of gases, energy, and motion. Wind stirs chemistry between them is porous fluid. Photosynthesis depends on this movement. Carbon dioxide enters through tiny openings on leaves, while oxygen exits. The balance of gases that sustains life on Earth is maintained by this delicate, rhythmic breath between the atmosphere and the living green. In this way, the wind doesn't just shape trees mechanically, it sustains them physiologically, and they, in turn, shape the composition of the very air that drives them. It's a feedback loop, a conversation between two ancient forces. If we were to slow time to the pace of trees, we might see the world differently. The gusts of air that seem momentary to us would become long, rolling waves. The seasons would appear as tides of motion. And through those tides, trees would sway, grow, and remember. The philosophy of stillness. There's something quietly philosophical about the way trees remember. They do not resist the wind with force. They yield and reshape. They absorb motion and translate it into strength. Human memory often clings to experience through recollection by holding it tightly. But trees show us another way, remembering by becoming, by integrating change into structure. Perhaps this is the wisdom of the forest, that memory need not be conscious to be profound. That endurance is a kind of intelligence, and that the world itself, through every bending branch and weathered root, keeps record of what has passed. When you stand beneath a canopy and hear the wind sigh through the leaves, you're listening to memory in motion, a story being rewritten each moment, yet built on every moment that came before. And maybe in some small way, the wind remembers too. The forest does not awaken suddenly. It rises gently, as though surfacing from a dream. The morning mist has lifted, and light falls through the canopy in long, golden shafts, catching the slow drift of dust and pollen. The air itself seems alive, carrying whispers of distant branches moving. The faint percussion of leaves brushing against each other. If you stand very still, you begin to realize something subtle. The forest is never silent and never still. Even in calm weather, trunks creak almost imperceptibly. Leaves flutter in microcurrents. Roots expand and contract with moisture. Each sound, each movement, is a continuation of the story we've been following. The story of memory written not in words or thoughts, but in the patterns of life itself. Because the wind never really stops, it only changes form. And trees never really forget. They keep remembering through shape, through chemistry, through time. Echoes of the wind inside the wood. Inside the heartwood of a mature tree, that dark, dense core no longer carrying water, traces of the world still remain. Resin hardened by a storm's wound, microscopic cracks sealed by the tree's slow repair, a change in the ratio of carbon isotopes revealing the pattern of sunlight decades ago. Even dead wood keeps memory. In ancient bogs, scientists have unearthed trunks preserved for thousands of years, their rings still bearing the rhythms of wind and drought from long before recorded history. By analyzing the structure of these rings, we can reconstruct not only temperature and rainfall, but also the intensity and direction of prevailing winds. The trees that once stood alive in the ancient winds of the Bronze Age now speak to us across millennia, through the language of growth and decay. They remind us that memory in the natural world does not depend on consciousness. It depends on persistence, the intelligence of flexibility. When engineers design tall buildings, they study trees. They watch how trunks taper upward, how branches distribute stress, how roots spread wide to anchor without rigidity. most human structures, trees do not resist wind completely. They yield, absorb, and return the energy. In biomechanics, this is called resonant damping. Each tree has its own natural frequency, a rhythm at which it sways. When wind matches that rhythm, motion amplifies. But trees have evolved ways to shift their resonance by adjusting water content and internal stiffness. It's as if they tune themselves to the wind. Over a lifetime, a tree's resonance can change, growing slower and more grounded with age. And this tuning is part of their memory. It's not stored in the brain, but in the interplay between physics and biology, a dynamic relationship between matter and motion. Humans, too, carry such resonance. The way we adapt to change, the way our voices and bodies respond to the world, all reflect a kind of lived tuning. But trees show us what it means to embody that principle for centuries, not decades. When the wind teaches the forest. In 1999, a powerful windstorm swept across Central Europe, felling more than 200 million cubic meters of timber. For months afterward, ecologists studied the fallen trees and those left standing. They noticed that in mixed forests, where species of different flexibilities grew together, damage was less severe. The wind's energy was dissipated unevenly, shared among farms. In a monoculture forest, by contrast, identical trees resonated together, amplifying the destruction. It was a quiet revelation. Diversity makes memory resilient. A forest that remembers many forms of movement, tall, short, broad, narrow, can survive better than one that remembers only one way to stand. And in that way, the memory of wind becomes a lesson in community. Each tree, by its structure, contributes to the forest's collective ability to endure. The whole becomes stronger than the sum of its trunks. This, too, is how ecosystems think not through thoughts, but through interactions shaped by history. Trees and the wind in art and thought. For as long as humans have watched trees, we have seen in them reflections of ourselves. In ancient China, poets wrote of the pine that bends but does not break, a symbol of endurance. In Norse mythology, the world itself grows from a tree, Yggdrasil, whose roots and branches hold the sky and underworld in balance. In Japanese Zen gardens, wind-sculpted pines embody impermanence, their forms shaped by unseen forces. Across cultures, wind and tree have always been metaphors for resilience and change, one shaping, one yielding. And perhaps that's because, even without science, people have long intuited what we now measure in laboratories. That to survive, one must move with the storm. That strength comes not from stillness, but from the ability to remember motion and remain standing after it. In art and philosophy, this truth takes on human meaning. In biology, it takes on structure and chemistry. But the essence is the same, the conversation between force and form, the slow intelligence of trees. There's a growing field of research called plant neurobiology, though the name is controversial since plants have no neurons. Its central idea is that plants can process information, respond to stimuli, and even learn over time through biochemical networks. When researchers repeatedly expose plants to specific stimuli, light, vibration, even sound, they find that plants adjust their future responses. In 2014, a team led by Monica Gagliano performed an experiment with Mimosa pudica, a plant that folds its leaves when touched. After repeated harmless drops, the plants stopped closing their leaves, as though they had learned the touch was not a threat. Weeks later, the the memory persisted. If a small herb can remember the absence of danger, how much might a forest remember the constant presence of wind? Each vibration, each subtle pull of air, leaves traces in countless cells and tissues. The tree is not aware, but it is adaptive. It is, in a very real sense, intelligent, just not in the way we define intelligence. The silence that speaks. At dusk, when the forest begins to cool, you might notice how the air settles. The wind fades, and with it, a kind of stillness arrives that is almost physical, as though the world is holding its breath. But even now, inside the trunks, behind after experience has passed through. So as the wind fades and the world grows still, perhaps you'll remember the trees. How they listened, how they learned, how they became the very shape of survival. And so, as we continue to drift deeper into this quiet study of wind and memory, let us look upward again, to the forest canopy. Because what happens in those emerald heights is nothing short of symphonic. Each leaf, each tiny petiole, that slender stalk connecting the leaf to the branch, responds to the wind in its own rhythm. It twists, pivots, and trembles. At first glance, it might seem chaotic, but the longer we watch, the more we realize there is an order to this dance. The forest canopy does not move like an ocean whipped by storm. It moves like breath, a shared, invisible respiration, a slow exhale of motion that ripples across the treetops. When the wind arrives, the trees do not fight it. They yield, distribute, and share the load. Some researchers, studying the biomechanics of trees, describe this as the dynamic reconfiguration of canopy architecture. A poetic way to say, trees bend to become more aerodynamic, reducing resistance and stress. In the process, they change their own geometry, not permanently at first, but enough to alter how future winds will touch them. In a grove of beeches in Germany, scientists once attached tiny accelerometers to branches, recording their motion during storms. What they found was astonishing. Even when branches looked still to the human eye, micro-vibrations continued long after the wind passed, a gentle quiver, like the afterecho of a bell. It was as though the wood retained the wind's fingerprint. And in time, those tiny echoes triggered slow biochemical responses, changes in growth hormone levels, shifts in cambial activity, subtle recalibrations to brace for what might come again. This, in essence, is memory without neurons, a kind of mechanical cognition, written in cellulose and sap instead of synapses and neurotransmitters. When you imagine a forest now, perhaps it feels less like a collection of still things and more like a thinking body, a distributed intelligence. Each trunk is a nerve, each root a wire, each gust a signal passing through the system. Wind doesn't just sculpt trees physically, it also shapes their social lives. In dense stands, neighboring trees influence one another's sway. Foresters have a term for this: crown shyness, the mysterious phenomenon where the outermost branches of tall trees avoid touching, leaving thin ribbons of sky between their crowns. Some believe this helps reduce the spread of disease or insects. Others think it minimizes mechanical damage from collisions in high winds. But perhaps more simply, it is the result of trees learning each other's boundaries through countless gentle brushes of breeze. A kind of etiquette born from motion. Imagine standing in a rainforest at dawn, the air heavy, the light diffuse, the first whispers of wind weaving between trunks. The canopy above isn't still, it's listening. It remembers yesterday's storm, last year's cyclone, decades of monsoon patterns. In the architecture of each branch, the curvature of each limb, the thickness of each ring, there are traces of wind long gone. Deep inside the trunk, these memories take root in wood anatomy itself. When a tree experiences persistent wind from one direction, it begins to reinforce its structure asymmetrically. The side facing the prevailing wind thickens, forming what botanists call reaction wood. In conifers, this is compression wood. In hardwoods, tension wood. Both serve a similar purpose, to counteract bending forces and restore verticality. This adaptation unfolds slowly, over years. The tree literally grows a story of struggle into its bones. Its rings are not perfect circles. They become ellipses, thicker on one side, thinner on another, an autobiography of pressure and persistence. Even after the tree dies, these traces endure. In cross-sections of timber hundreds of years old, dendrochronologists, tree ring scientists, can read wind history like an old diary. A cluster of narrow rings might tell of a wind-exposed ridge, a stormy decade, or even a neighboring tree that fell, altering the air's flow. The memory remains, preserved in lignin and cellulose, waiting for human eyes to translate it again into story. There's a quiet comfort in realizing that memory, in nature, does not require consciousness. The earth remembers through form. The desert remembers through dunes reshaped by wind. The mountain remembers through scars of erosion. And trees, they remember through the tilt of their trunks, the density of their fibers, the dance of their leaves when the wind returns. When we walk among them, we walk through living history, a slow record of resilience, written in vertical lines. It's as though every gust of wind we feel on our skin is part of a much larger conversation, one that's been happening since the first plant reached for the sky. Let's pause for a moment here. If you close your eyes, imagine yourself sitting beneath a tall cedar, the air still but expectant. The leaves shift faintly, the way breath trembles before speech. You might not see it, but inside the trunk, millions of cells are stretching, compressing, communicating. The tree is alive in ways we seldom perceive, not only metabolically, but mechanically, electrically, hydraulically. Tiny electrical potentials flow through its tissues, not unlike neurons firing in the human brain. When a branch bends in wind, these microcurrents fluctuate. It's been observed that changes in voltage can cascade into biochemical signals, altering the movement of calcium ions, which in turn modulate growth and gene expression. What we call memory in animals, the capacity to adapt based on prior experience, is, in some sense, mirrored here in plants. The tree does not think as we do, but it adjusts, it learns, and it anticipates. Even seedlings display this strange awareness. In laboratory experiments, when young plants are gently touched or mechanically stimulated, they alter their growth trajectory. If the same movement happens again, the plant's response diminishes, as if it remembers the experience and recognizes it as non-threatening. This phenomenon, known as habituation, is one of the simplest forms of memory observed in biology. So perhaps when we say trees remember the wind, it's not a metaphor at all. It's a literal biological truth, one expressed not through recollection, but through embodiment. They carry their memories in form, not thought. But what of the wind itself? What does it remember? Every gust is born somewhere, over an ocean, across a valley, between warm and cold fronts that have danced for millennia. The wind that brushes your face today might once have swept through cedar groves in Japan, or desert dunes in North Africa. In this sense, the wind is also a carrier of memory, a physical record of temperature, geography, and motion. When it passes through the forest, it doesn't just shape the trees. It listens to them too and carries traces of their scent, their pollen, their moisture into the wider world. The earth then becomes a single breathing organism, atmosphere and biosphere exchanging memories with every breeze. Somewhere deep in the Amazon, an old kapok tree leans slightly to the east, its vast crown catching the wind like a sail. It has stood there for nearly 400 years. Generations of wind have carved their signature into its massive frame.
Every curve of its trunk is a chapter, every scar a remembered storm. When the night air moves through its canopy, it hums, a low, almost inaudible tone resonating through its wood. Scientists call these sounds acoustic emissions, the faint crackle of microscopic fibers stretching and settling. But maybe, on a quieter level, it's the tree's way of whispering back to the wind that raised it. I remember you. The forest is never truly silent. Even when the air stills and the leaves hang motionless, there is a low hum beneath everything, a quiet pulse, invisible to the ear but alive in the soil. This hum is the voice of connection, because trees do not live in isolation. Each one, from the youngest sapling to the oldest oak, is part of a vast, subterranean web, an intricate network of roots, fungi, and microbes. This hidden infrastructure, often called the mycorrhizal network, is sometimes described as the wood wide web. Through it, nutrients flow, electrical signals flicker, and in ways we are only beginning to understand, information moves. If the wind is the language of the canopy, then the soil is the language of memory. Here underfoot, trees whisper to one another about drought, danger, and change. And perhaps, among these signals, they also share the memory of the wind, the pressures and patterns that shape their collective growth. Imagine the forest floor beneath your feet, a dense tapestry of roots interlaced with threads of fungal hyphae, so fine that a single gram of soil might contain several kilometers of them. These filaments act as both messengers and mediators. When a tree is rocked by wind, its root pressure shifts. The movement travels down the trunk, through its vascular system into the ground, a faint hydraulic pulse. Neighboring roots detect this change, responding in kind. In the lab, scientists have observed how mechanical stress in one part of a plant can trigger electrical and hormonal responses in another, even across different individuals connected by fungi. It's as if the forest itself absorbs the tremor, diffusing it through its collective body, a distributed sensitivity, a shared awareness. When the wind sweeps across the treetops, then, it doesn't just move wood and leaf. It moves information, weaving through every layer of the ecosystem, from sky to soil, from leaf to lichen. And each level remembers in its own quiet way. In 1997, Susan Simard, a forest ecologist in British Columbia, made a discovery that reshaped how we think about trees. She demonstrated that carbon, the very breath of life exchanged during photosynthesis, could pass from one tree to another through underground fungal networks. Later experiments revealed something even more profound. When one tree was stressed by drought or damage, it could send chemical warnings through the network, altering the behavior of its neighbors. Simard called these large, central individuals mother trees. They act as hubs, older, deeply rooted beings that nourish and guide younger saplings. They seem to sense where help is needed, adjusting their flow of carbon, nitrogen, and water accordingly. Now imagine what happens when such a mother tree feels the wind. Its branches sway, its roots pull and release with subtle tension. The vibrations travel through the ground, modulating pressures and electric fields. And though we cannot yet fully measure it, the network below might be registering that same event, a tremor in the common memory of the forest. Wind, then, becomes not only a sculptor of individual trees, but a kind of collective teacher. It trains the forest as a whole to flex, yield, and stand together. We tend to picture wind as chaotic, as random, unpredictable motion. But to the forest, the wind has a grammar. It has rhythms and tones that recur across seasons and years. Spring breezes are gentle rehearsals. Winter gales are lessons in endurance. Each generation of trees inherits this invisible curriculum. A seedling born in the lee of a windbreak grows differently from one exposed to open plains. Its wood forms with fewer spiral grains, its canopy learns restraint. And when storms come, it survives or falls according to that early education. The forest, in this way, practices what we might call ecological memory, the capacity of an ecosystem to retain the imprint of past events and translate them into resilience. Every species, every layer of soil, carries a piece of that memory. Even after a fire or a hurricane, traces remain in the soil microbiome, in the genetic tendencies of regrown saplings, in the pattern of returning mosses. The memory of wind, fire, flood, these are not erased but absorbed, shaping the next cycle. When wind passes through a grove of aspen, the result is hypnotic, thousands of leaves fluttering in near-perfect unison. Their flattened stems, or petioles, allow them to twist and shimmer, scattering light like a million coins in motion. But what's remarkable is how the grove itself responds as a single organism. Aspens often grow from shared root systems, vast underground colonies that can stretch for acres. Each trunk we see above ground is technically a stem of one enormous being, connected by living tissue. When wind sways one, it sways them all. Their shared roots distribute the strain, preventing any single trunk from bearing too much. This cooperation is not conscious, but it is profoundly intelligent. It represents a principle found throughout life, distributed sensitivity, where the well-being of the whole depends on the communication of its parts. In that sense, wind teaches unity. It binds trees into a living architecture of balance and support. Let's move deeper now into how trees feel the wind. Within each cell wall lies a network of tiny fibers, microfibrils, bound together by flexible polymers. When wind bends a branch, these fibers stretch and compress. Sensors embedded in the cell membranes, proteins known as mechanoreceptors, detect this tension. They open channels, allowing ions like calcium to flood into the cell. This simple movement of ions becomes a signal, spreading from cell to cell like a slow, silent wave. Over time, the repeated triggering of these receptors builds a kind of mechanical memory. The plant learns to anticipate the pattern of force, responding more efficiently each time. It may thicken its cell walls, redirect growth hormones, or alter its lignin composition, all subtle adjustments made in response to remembered motion. If a sapling is grown in still air, it develops differently, tall, thin, fragile. But if it is brushed gently each day, it grows shorter, stronger, more resilient. This phenomenon, thigmomorphogenesis, shows how physical experience becomes structure. The memory of touch, of movement, is literally built into the body of the tree. In a way, wind is both the teacher and the sculptor, instructing trees in how to be strong by making them sway. At night, when the forest quiets, those lessons are stored. Sap continues to flow, but slowly. Cells repair themselves. Biochemical signals fade into long-term changes in gene expression. It's not unlike sleep, that sacred time when animals consolidate their memories. Perhaps trees, too, enter a kind of deep processing phase, where the sensations of the day are translated into growth. If you could stand in that forest, eyes closed, you might sense it. A living system, humming softly in the dark, remembering the shape of the wind. In some indigenous traditions, the wind is not just a force of weather. It is a spirit of memory, a carrier of voices. It is said that when the wind moves through the trees, it is the ancestors speaking, reminding the forest of what once was. Science might phrase it differently, but the essence is the same. The past leaves a trace in the present. Every breeze carries echoes of what has come before. When we listen to the wind, then, we're not just feeling air. We're brushing against the stored experiences of the world, the accumulated memory of motion, translated into rustle and sigh. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson here. Memory doesn't have to be conscious to be profound. The earth remembers without words. It writes in patterns of growth, in layers of soil, in the way a forest bends but does not break. When the next wind comes, as it always does, each tree will move differently because of the ones that came before. And in that movement lies a kind of wisdom. That strength is not the absence of bending, but the grace of remembering how to return. Somewhere, perhaps tonight, the wind is singing through a forest. You might not notice it at first, only the distant hush, the layered whisper of leaves moving in uneven waves. But if you listen closely, you begin to hear structure, tone, rhythm, resonance. The forest is not merely moved by the wind, it plays it, like an instrument tuned over centuries. Every trunk, every branch, every hollow between roots becomes part of a grand orchestra, an acoustic cathedral of wood and air. The low groans of old oaks, the higher tremolos of birch and aspen, the dry chatter of pine needles rubbing together, all of it composes a single living score. And through it the trees remember. Because wind is not only a sculptor of shape and strength, it is also a teacher of sound. Over time, the tones a forest produces become part of its feedback loop, shaping how animals interact with it, how seeds disperse, how communication evolves. This is the music of resilience, the echo of movement stored in matter. When wind travels through a branch, it doesn't move uniformly. Different frequencies pass through wood at different speeds, depending on the density and moisture of the tissue. These vibrations are subtle, inaudible to us most of the time, but they create standing waves that help the tree sense its own structure. In a sense, the tree listens to itself. Researchers studying acoustic emissions in plants discovered that these vibrations increase when trees are under stress. During drought, tiny air bubbles form in the water-conducting vessels, a process called cavitation. Each bubble's collapse produces a faint ultrasonic pop, like a sigh beneath the bark. By recording these sounds, scientists can tell when a tree is thirsty, struggling, or even dying, all without cutting into it. But there's another layer here, one less studied but profoundly beautiful to consider. When the wind moves through a tree and the tree responds, both are changed. The air learns to move differently through the space. The wood, reshaped by countless such encounters, becomes more attuned to the patterns of its environment. Over decades, even centuries, this interaction becomes a kind of acoustic memory, not in the brain, but in the resonance of matter. Think of a violin. A new one sounds raw, a little unrefined. But after years of being played, its tone matures. The vibrations align the fibers of the wood, compressing resins and shaping the microscopic pathways of sound. The violin begins to remember the music it has made. Now imagine the same principle applied to a forest. Every storm, every passing breeze, every small movement of animal or rain adds to the acoustic history of wood. A living violin of immense scale, tuned by the earth's own breath. There are stories of foresters who can identify trees by their sound alone, the creak of a pine, the hollow echo of an ash trunk, the deep tone of a beech when struck gently by the hand. These aren't coincidences. They're signatures of structure, of memory carved into grain. Sound, like wind, carries far more than motion. It carries information. Birds have long used the forest's acoustic qualities to navigate and communicate. Certain species choose nesting sites based on how sound travels through the trees. Dense canopies dampen calls. Open groves amplify them. Even insects respond to these cues. Some cicadas adjust their songs depending on wind and vegetation, ensuring their mates can still hear them through the shifting chorus of leaves. The forest then becomes a living soundscape, a feedback system where the behavior of life is shaped by the sound of its own environment. Over time, the forest learns from this music. It grows denser in some places, thinner in others, altering its own acoustics to balance wind, water, and animal life. Every echo, every vibration feeds back into growth. This is memory at the ecosystem scale, slow, resonant, enduring. Long before science sought to explain these things, people felt them. Ancient cultures saw the wind as the breath of gods, a sacred voice carried through trees. In Norse mythology, Yggdrasil, the world tree, holds the realms together, its leaves rustling with divine whispers.